This is my MX5 Mk3 2-litre Roadster 2007, and what I want to share with you is replacement of these rear subframe tie bars, which can be a real problem. And the problem is removing the old one, and you can see this is one I took off. And apparently this is a very common problem, particularly in UK, and is often an MOT failure. This is the top side that goes under the vehicle, so when you look at it from underneath, it's not always evident. And the problem is removing these fixings. These are very, very problematic, and I'll explain the reasons why, and I'll show you my method on how I remove these. Everybody may have their own version. Some people have actually welded and repaired these in situ simply because removing these bolts is difficult. And one of the problems is the actual bolts themselves, but I'll explain that later. This is the rear subframe brace bar on the left hand side of the vehicle. You've got the same arrangement on the other side. You've got two fixings there that go into the subframe, and you've got one fixing down at the other end. All the fixings are the same size. They're a 12mm by 25 hexagon headed set screw. Little bit different in some respects. The Mazda fittings come with 17mm socket size head. Normally on a 12mm bolt or set screw you would have a 19mm socket, and that's the problem, locating these and releasing, because as you can see they're captive. There's no way you can get to the nut both on that side and at the other end. More about that later, but I think it's important. You can use this hole here and you can spray liberal amounts of releasing fluid, and you have the same at the other end. It's not very clear, but using that hole there, it is possible to spray into there and it will help. But more about that later. These are the two brace bars that we're talking about, viewed from the under the side of the car. This is one that I've taken off, and the problem is when you try and remove these bolts, and there are 3 of them, it's very difficult, and I will explain the reason why it's such a problem in removing those. I've done a little mock-up to explain what the problem is. This is the floor of the car, or it could also be the subframe. This nut is welded in situ, and you cannot gain access to this because obviously it's between the cavity, and I'll explain how you remove that. Back to my little sample which explains some of the problems. This hexagonal set screw is 12mm by 25, and in my opinion it's way too long, because when it's in situ there is at least 10mm of thread protruding past the nut, and what will happen on an older car, this will rust around the top. So when you try and remove it, initially it will start to unscrew, but gradually what you're trying to do is to pull this or unscrew it through this nut, and that's where the problems occur. So you can see the problem on this bolt here. Clean thread and rust. So how do we go about removing this screw? First thing we need to do, as best we can, and you probably saw this not very clearly on the underside of the vehicle, we need to get some releasing fluid onto this area here. There are holes on the underside in the subframe and the floor where you can, if you're lucky, direct some of this fluid onto this, and the best thing to do is leave it overnight and then come back the following morning. Assuming we've left it overnight with some penetrating fluid, the next thing is to make sure that this area around here on the head of the bolt is as clean as you can get it, because it's vitally important that when we come to locate the socket on the top, we want to avoid that situation there where it's just not going down far enough. It needs to go all the way down. The next thing is to ensure that you use an hexagonal socket. This is 10 mil. I would not even attempt to use that type of socket. We've got three problems that can potentially happen with this. One is that we could shear the weld on this nut, and if we do, that's a big problem. But the main thing that can happen is this nut gets rounded off. If that happens, you're into a completely different ball game, which is going to involve cutting, welding, tapping, and a lot of time and expense. So it's important to use this type of socket. And when you remove it, you need a bar, and it's important that when you release this, you keep it parallel so it's 90 degrees to the thread. Don't try using something like this, because all that will do is twist and it could shear. So it's important that you use something like that. These things are so tight, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to do it with a conventional wrench. What I find is that initially, when we're releasing these, try and tighten before you start to release. Only a fraction, but in doing that and then bringing it anti-clockwise, it frees it up. And you'll find that as you gradually start to undo this, with a liberal dose of fluid, it will help. And it's worth just trying to get that sort of action. And it is worth persevering to get these out, because if they shear or they round off, it's a big problem. When I replace these, I'm not going to be using the original Mazda fixings, because I think they're grossly overpriced and just very poor. I'm going to be using 12 mil metric fine with a standard head, which takes a 19 mil socket, so it will be located like that. Of course, this will be cut down to avoid this situation here. Before I assemble everything, what I will do is just tidy up the threads using 12 mil metric fine plug tap. I'll show you the job when it's finished. Okay, this is the rear subframe brace bar in position. Nice and shiny. That's the other end. All I've got to do now is give it a good coating of wax oil. You see there the replacement hexagon headed set screws and washers that have replaced, far superior to the Mazda fittings. So there we have it.